The crystal caught the candlelight the way it always did in that house. Everything expensive, everything arranged, everything performing a version of happiness that had nothing to do with the people inside it. Gerald Whitfield cleared his throat. 61 years old, semi-retired, the kind of man who still introduced himself by his former firm. He stood at the head of the table with his wine glass raised, and 24 people went quiet because that was what you did when Gerald spoke. You went quiet. You waited. You gave him the room. I was sitting at the far end. I am always at the far end. My name is Sage Whitfield. I am 32 years old, and I work as a biomedical data analyst at a research hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. I find patterns in numbers that other people miss. I have been doing a version of that my entire life, long before anyone gave me a job title for it. And on that Christmas Eve, sitting at the table I had sat at every December since I was 3 years old, I was watching Gerald the way I watch an outlier in a data set, quietly, precisely. Without letting him know, I had already run the calculation. The house smelled like roasted turkey and pine and Vivian's candles, the tall white ones she ordered from a catalog and placed in silver holders she polished twice a year. Someone's silverware scraped against the good china. A cousin near the window laughed at something and then caught herself because Gerald had stood, and when Gerald stood, you stopped laughing. He raised his glass. He looked down the table. He looked at me. "I want to say something," he said. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Across from me, Brooke, 35, my father's actual daughter, the one who had always known exactly what she was in this family, reached for her water glass. Her husband, Trent, sitting beside her, had been smiling a moment ago. The smile was gone now. I watched it leave his face the way color leaves a wound. "We never loved you," Gerald said. "You were a mistake." 25 people. The room did not erupt, it collapsed. That is the only word for it. Every conversation, every small noise, every clink of silverware fell away at once, and what was left was a silence so complete I could hear the candles. I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. "Thank you for your honesty," I said. Not loud, not theatrical, the way you might thank a pharmacist for confirming a dosage. I set the glass back down on the tablecloth. White linen, pressed, one of Vivian's requirements, and I did not look away from Gerald. Someone gasped. A chair scraped back somewhere to my left. Rosemary, Gerald's older sister, 67 years old, and the only person at that table who had ever asked me how I was and meant it, had her phone in her hand. She had been recording a holiday montage all evening, table decorations, cousins greeting each other, the dog by the fireplace. She was still recording. I noticed the phone. I did not look at it directly. Brooke had not moved. Her eyes were on her plate, fixed there with the concentration of someone who has decided that if she does not look up, none of this will have officially happened. Trent was looking at Brooke. Brooke was not looking back. He set his napkin on the table, slowly, carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you do not want anyone to know. Dinner continued because Gerald sat back down and picked up his fork, and when Gerald picked up his fork, dinner continued. That was how it had always worked. He set the pace, he set the tone, he decided when a moment was over. Two of my aunts began talking to each other in low voices. A cousin refilled his wine. The machine kept running because no one had been given permission to stop it. Rosemary reached across the table and touched my hand. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" she said. "I was thinking about you last week, actually. You always had so many doctor's visits when you were little, more than any kid I knew. Are you healthy? Everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said. "Thank you for asking." Gerald had gone very still. Not the stillness of a man at rest, the stillness of a man recalibrating. His fork was in his hand, but he was not eating. His eyes moved to Rosemary and then away, a gesture so small most people at that table would not have caught it. I caught it. I had been catching things like that my entire life. After dinner, the house became the usual theater of cleanup and conversation and dessert trays carried from the kitchen, and I stood in it for 40 minutes because leaving too soon would have been a scene, and I was not there to make a scene. I was there to collect one. At 9:15, I put on my coat. The cold hit as soon as I pushed through the front door. Connecticut, in December. The kind of cold that has no patience for you, that comes straight through whatever you are wearing and reminds you that the warmth inside was always temporary. I crossed the driveway toward my car. The gravel crunched under my boots. My breath came out in short white clouds. Sage, Vivian's voice. Behind me. Not far enough behind me. Vivian Whitfield, 58, Gerald's wife for 35 years, the woman who had raised me with the specific warmth of someone who needed witnesses. She appeared at the edge of the porch light in her cashmere cardigan, arms crossed, her face arranged into the expression she used for difficult conversations. Not anger, never anything as honest as anger. Concern. Disappointment. The careful face of a woman who had already decided how this conversation would be remembered. "Sweetheart," she said, "I want you to understand something. I'm going to head home, Vivian." "If you hadn't provoked him," she said it the way you state a fact, no preamble, no apology building toward it. "By showing up uninvited when he has made it clear that your relationship needs distance right now." I was invited. Sage. I had the text. I took my phone from my coat pocket. The screen lit up. From Brooke. December 17th, 7:42 in the evening. Christmas Eve, 6 o'clock. Don't bring anything. Vivian has it handled. Would you like to see it? Vivian's expression did not change. That was the thing about Vivian. Her face was not connected to what she was actually thinking. It was a separate system entirely, running its own programming, and what it displayed had been selected in advance. "Your father is under a great deal of stress," she said. "Good night, Vivian." I got in my car. I did not cry. There was nothing to cry about, or rather, there was nothing new to cry about. The thing Gerald had said at that table was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. The difference between those two things is the difference between a wound and a scar. One of them is still happening, and one of them stopped hurting years ago. I pulled out of the driveway and drove 3 blocks before I stopped at a red light and picked up my phone. One contact. The call connected on the second ring. "He said it," I told her. On camera. Lorraine Kepler. 64, retired estate attorney, the sharpest person I had ever met and the only one I had fully trusted in 3 years, was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I'll file the motion the moment it opens," she said. I put the phone down and drove home. Christmas morning was quiet in my apartment. Coffee, the radiator ticking, gray light through the kitchen window. I had been awake since 5. Not from distress, from habit. When you spend 3 years building something carefully, in secret, the mornings after significant events are very still. You have planned for them. You have accounted for them. There is nothing left to worry about, and that absence of worry feels, at first, almost like its own kind of disorientation. The knock came at 8:47. 2 men, plain clothes, identification already in hand when I opened the door. Detectives from the federal task force. Not there for me, not there to deliver bad news. Not there as anything other than what they were, the next scheduled step in a process I had been part of for 8 months. "Ms. Whitfield," the taller one said, "we're here to take your formal statement. We appreciate your continued cooperation." "Come in," I said. I just made coffee. I want to be clear about something because the shape of this story might suggest that Christmas Eve was the beginning. It was not. The beginning was 12 years ago when I was 20 and a credit card company told me I had a financial history I had never created. What happened at that dinner table was not an ambush I survived. It was a detonation I had been building, quietly, in the dark, for 3 years. Gerald Whitfield thought he was ending something when he raised that glass. He was finishing something I had already started. And the morning after, he told 25 of our relatives that I was a mistake. 2 federal detectives sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee, and we talked about what comes next. This is what came next. The detectives left at 11. I washed their cups, put them back in the cabinet, and stood at the kitchen window for a while watching the street below. Hartford in December. A few cars. Someone walking a dog in a red coat, moving fast against the cold. The city had the particular quiet of a holiday morning when most people were somewhere else, somewhere they belonged. I made another cup of coffee and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I thought about what it means to tell a story in the right order. The right order is not always the order things happened. Sometimes you have to go back to understand why the ending was the only ending possible. Gerald Whitfield stood at the head of his Christmas table and announced to 25 people that he had never loved me, and to anyone watching, it looked like cruelty delivered without warning. But cruelty that specific does not come without a history. And I had been living inside that history for 32 years. I was 3 years old when Gerald and Vivian brought me home. I have no memory of arriving, no memory of a before. The Whitfield house in Westport was simply where I woke up, where I ate breakfast, where I learned the particular grammar of that family and tried to speak it the way they did. I was quiet. I was careful. I watched Brooke the way you study a native speaker when you are learning a language from scratch. Brooke was 6 when I arrived. 3 years older, which in childhood is enough to be a different species entirely. She had her own room, lavender walls, curtains Vivian had sewn herself from fabric Brooke had chosen at a store in Greenwich. My room was at the end of the hall, pale green walls, furniture that did not match, a window that faced the back fence. I did not question any of this. Children rarely question what they are given when what they are given is the only thing they have ever known. The hand-me-down clothes I did not mind much. It was the photographs that taught me something I could not have named then. 7 frames on the mantel above the fireplace in the living room. Brooke's school photos. Brooke's recital. Brooke and Vivian at the beach. Gerald and Brooke at a baseball game. I was in one of them, at the far edge of a Christmas shot, half-cropped, smiling at something outside the frame. 1 photograph out of 7. When you are a child, you absorb information like that without processing it. It goes in and sits somewhere, and you build a life around it, and you do not excavate it until much later, when you have the language and the distance to understand what you were being told. The phrase was, "We took you in." That was the sentence Vivian and Gerald used whenever I expressed something they found inconvenient. When I asked to take art classes in 4th grade and Vivian said she did not see the point. When I came home at 15 with a B- on a history test, and Gerald said he expected more from someone with my advantages. When I was 17 and wanted to spend Thanksgiving with a friend's family, just once, and the silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "We took you in." It was a sentence ender. It closed every conversation it entered. It meant, your presence here is conditional and do not forget it. I learned very young not to forget it. Gerald's home office was on the 2nd floor, past the bathroom with the good towels Vivian kept folded in thirds. He worked in there most evenings, the door closed, the light visible under the gap at the bottom. I walked past it 10,000 times. When I was 9, I knocked once because I had a question about a school project and he was the only parent home. He opened the door maybe 6 inches and told me to ask Vivian in the morning. Through the gap I saw his desk, 2 monitors, stacks of manila folders, and at the side wall a gray metal filing cabinet with a combination lock on the top drawer. I noticed the key the same year. It lived on his keychain, separate from the house keys and the car key, on a small ring of its own. He never set the keychain down where anyone might pick it up. It went from his hand to his pocket to the hook by the garage door and nowhere else. I did not know what was in that cabinet. I asked once when I was 11, and Vivian appeared from the kitchen as if she had been listening for exactly that question. "Grown-up paperwork," she said, "not for kids." She changed the subject so smoothly that I did not realize she had done it until 20 minutes later. The doctor's visits were simply part of life. More than my friends had, I understood that in retrospect. But at the time, I assumed I was simply a child who needed monitoring. There was never anything wrong. Every visit ended with the doctor telling Gerald that everything looked fine, that I was healthy, that I was developing normally. Gerald always came to those appointments. Not Vivian. Gerald. He sat in the chair beside the examination table, and he listened, and he asked the questions, and the drive home was always quiet. I was a grateful child. That was the word people used for me. Teachers wrote it in report cards. Relatives said it at holiday dinners. Sage is so grateful. Sage appreciates everything she has. What they were observing, I think now, was not gratitude. It was vigilance. I was a child who understood at some cellular level that her position in that house was not guaranteed, and the way you protect a position that is not guaranteed is to make yourself easy to keep. You do not ask for the art classes. You do not complain about the hand-me-downs. You smile in photographs when you are called into frame, and you do not ask why you are so rarely called. I was good at it. I got very, very good at it. College broke the first seal. I went to UConn on a partial academic scholarship. The Whitfields did not contribute to tuition. Gerald said something about the scholarship covering the important parts, and Vivian said something about learning the value of self-sufficiency. And I did not push because pushing had never worked, and because I had already filed my own financial aid paperwork 3 months before either conversation happened. I was 18. I had learned to plan quietly. It was my sophomore year, October, when I applied for a student credit card to cover textbooks for the spring semester. The application came back denied within 48 hours. The reason listed was existing debt-to-credit ratio. I stared at that phrase for a long time because I had no credit cards, no loans in my name, no debt of any kind. I was 20 years old and I had never borrowed $1 from anyone. I requested my credit report. What came back had my name, my social security number, my date of birth, and 7 open accounts I had never created, a department store card opened when I was 12, a revolving line of credit opened when I was 14, a mortgage co-signature dated when I was 15 years old, my signature on a document I had never seen for a house I had never been to, a credit history beginning at age 9, steady and detailed and entirely fictional. I called Gerald from my dorm room. It was a Wednesday afternoon. He answered on the 3rd ring. "It is a family arrangement," he said. "These things are handled in a particular way, and they do not concern you. Do not call the credit bureau. Do not make inquiries. I will take care of it. What family arrangement requires my social security number and my signature on a mortgage?" "Sage." His voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to remind you of your place without raising the volume. "I said I will handle it. Is that not enough?" It was not enough, but I said it was. I said thank you, and I hung up the phone, and I opened my laptop, and I created a folder on my desktop that I labeled Personal Admin, and I began to save things. The credit report, photographs of each page. The denial letter, the date and time of the phone call, and a summary of what Gerald had said, typed out in a plain document while his voice was still in my ear. I did not know what I was saving it for. I was 20 years old, and I did not have the framework yet for what I was looking at. I knew something was wrong. I knew the shape of the wrong, even if I could not name it. So I saved everything, and I closed the laptop, and I went to my afternoon class, and I did not bring it up again. 2 weeks later, I pulled one more thread. I had been thinking about what Gerald said. Family arrangement, handled in a particular way. I did not know what that meant, but I knew who it meant, which was him, which was always him, which had been him my entire life. So I went to the Social Security Administration website, and I requested my earnings history, the full record of every dollar attributed to my Social Security number. The document arrived in the mail 10 days later. There were earnings listed for me starting at age 9, a 9-year-old with a work history. Income reported annually from an entity I did not recognize, in amounts that made no sense for a child and no sense for any job I might have held. I turned the page over. I turned it back. I read it 3 more times. I did not know what I was looking at. Not precisely. But something in the part of my brain that had spent 20 years learning to read this particular family told me I had just found the edge of something much larger than a family arrangement. I photographed every page. I emailed them to myself. I put them in the folder. Then I closed the folder, put my laptop away, and went to study for a midterm. I was 20 years old. I did not have a lawyer, did not have the knowledge or the money to pursue whatever this was. What I had was the folder and the habit of saving things and the patience I had been building since I was 3 years old, and arrived in a house where nothing was guaranteed and everything required watching. I waited. I finished college. I got my job in Hartford, the data analyst position at the research hospital, where I would spend the next 7 years learning to find patterns in numbers that other people dismissed as noise. I moved into my apartment and I built a life that was genuinely mine. And every few months I added something to the folder, and every few months the folder got heavier. I was 29 when I finally found her name. By then I had gotten good enough at the research to know where to look, and patient enough to go slowly. And I ran a background search on my own adoption records that I should have been able to access years earlier but had been quietly, consistently obstructed from reaching every time I tried through the Whitfields. I went directly to the state. I submitted the formal request. 6 weeks later, a document arrived. Her name was Helen Rowe, my biological grandmother. She had died when I was 2 years old, a woman I had no memory of, who had existed in the corner of my life as nothing but a name on a document I had never been shown. She was not poor. Helen Rowe had owned a farmhouse and 12 acres in central Vermont and had left behind an estate modest enough to avoid much attention and significant enough to matter. I requested the probate records from the Vermont Surrogate Court. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself I just wanted to understand the shape of where I came from. What came back was not what I was prepared for. A trust fund, established in my name by Helen Rowe's estate attorney in the year she died. Approximately $800,000 to be administered by my legal guardian until I turned 35, or until the guardian was legally disqualified, whichever came first. The trust was real. It was documented. It had my name on every page. The current balance, the last statement I could legally access, was $38,000. I printed every page of the probate record. I sat at my kitchen table and I read through each one 3 times, the way I read datasets when something is not adding up and I need to be absolutely certain before I say anything. Then I sat back in my chair and I looked at the wall for a long time. I knew what this meant. Not the legal mechanics of it yet, not the specific names for what had happened, but the meaning of it in the most fundamental sense. The money in that trust had not disappeared. Money does not disappear. It moves. Someone had moved it for 29 years in amounts small enough to avoid immediate notice and consistent enough to finance a life. I thought about Brooke's sorority dues. I thought about Brooke's wedding, the venue in Fairfield County with the valet parking and the string quartet. I thought about Brooke's house, the down payment Gerald and Vivian had been so pleased to provide, the pride in Vivian's voice when she mentioned it at family dinners. I thought about the locked filing cabinet with the key Gerald kept on a separate ring. The next morning I called a legal aid hotline and described what I had found without using any names. The intake coordinator transferred me to a referral network. 3 days later I had an appointment. Lorraine Kepler worked out of a small office in a converted Victorian in New Haven. 64 years old, retired from private practice, now doing pro bono work for cases she found interesting, which was her way of saying cases where someone had been genuinely wronged and the law had a remedy and she intended to find it. She had short silver hair and glasses she pushed up with one finger when she was thinking. She read every document I had brought, in order, without speaking. When she finished, she pushed her glasses up and looked at me. "This is federal," she said. "Wire fraud, identity theft, financial exploitation of a minor. Possibly tax evasion, depending on what we find when we pull the investment records." "I expected it to be bad," I said. "I did not expect it to be that bad. There is something else." She turned to a page in the trust document and placed her finger at the bottom of the 3rd section. "This clause. If the appointed guardian publicly disowns or repudiates the named beneficiary, guardianship is automatically revoked and full control transfers to the beneficiary upon petition to the court." I read it. I read it again. "That is unusual," I said. "Very unusual." Helen Rowe's attorney was extraordinarily specific. Lorraine looked at me over her glasses, almost like she expected someone to try exactly what was tried. I thought about a woman I had never met, who had died when I was 2, who had looked at the structure of the world and understood something about the people who would be in charge of her granddaughter's future, who had sat with an attorney in Vermont and said, "Put in a clause for if they turn on her, put in a way out." The drive to Vermont took 3 hours and 40 minutes. I had looked up Helen Rowe's last address in the county records, and I drove there on a Saturday in November. Not because I thought I would find anything useful, just because I needed to see it. The farmhouse had been sold years earlier. There was a different car in the driveway and curtains I did not recognize in the windows, and someone had painted the shutters a dark red that had been there long enough to start peeling. I sat in my car in front of it for a while. 12 acres of fields and tree lines stretching back behind the house. A stone wall along the road, bare-limbed maples that would have been full and green when she was alive. A woman I had never met had tried to protect me before I was old enough to protect myself. I was not going to let that be for nothing. I drove back to Hartford. I called Lorraine from the highway. I told her I was ready to begin. The case took shape the way careful things do, slowly, without announcement, one verified document at a time. Lorraine and I met every 3 weeks in her New Haven office. I brought what I had. She told me what we still needed. The federal complaint was drafted in pieces, each section reviewed, each claim tied to a specific document with a specific date and a specific account number. We did not rush. Rushing is how you give someone a reason to dismiss you. Gerald did not know any of this was happening. That was the part that required the most discipline, not the research, not the document requests, not the legal maneuvering, the silence. Going to Christmas dinner the previous year and sitting at the far end of the table and eating Vivian's food and saying the right things to the right aunts and uncles and driving home afterward with everything I knew, locked somewhere behind my sternum where it would not show on my face. Gerald looked at me across that table and saw what he had always seen. A quiet woman, a grateful daughter, someone he had successfully managed for 3 decades. He was still seeing that when things began to change. It started with my supervisor. Dr. Hannah Yi called me into her office on a Tuesday in February, 10 months before Christmas. I had worked under her for 4 years. She was precise and fair, and she had the particular quality of good managers everywhere, which is that she addressed problems directly rather than letting them fester. When I sat down across from her desk, I noticed she had closed the door behind me, which she did not usually do for routine check-ins. "Sage," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you because I think you deserve that. I appreciate it. Someone identifying himself as your father called our HR department last week. He expressed concern about stress affecting your judgment at work. He described what he called a pattern of erratic behavior at home and suggested we keep an eye on things here." She paused. "I want to hear from you directly." The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system running above the ceiling tiles. I understood exactly what Gerald had done. He did not know about the investigation. Lorraine was certain of that, and I was too, because if he had known, he would have done something far more aggressive than a phone call to HR. What he knew was that I had been distant, that Brooke's scouting visit had produced nothing, that the cease and desist letter he had sent had not generated the response he expected, which was compliance. Gerald was a man who worked by preemption. When he sensed something shifting in a situation he could not fully see, he moved to control the perimeter. Discredit the source before the source speaks. I looked at Dr. Alder, Yi, and I kept my voice level and my hands still in my lap. "I appreciate you asking me directly," I said. "May I ask whether he described anything specific, any incident or behavior he could point to?" She shook her head slightly. "He did not." "Because there is nothing specific," I said. "My father and I have a complicated relationship. He does not have insight into my professional conduct, and I would gently suggest he is not a reliable source of information about my state of mind." I paused. "Is there anything you have observed yourself that concerns you?" "No," Dr. Yi said. "That's actually why I wanted to hear from you. Your work has been excellent. It continues to be excellent." "Then I think you have your answer." She nodded once. She uncrossed her hands on the desk. "I wanted you to know it happened. I thought that was the right thing to do." "It was," I said. "Thank you." I walked back to my desk. I sat down. I opened the data set I had been working on before the meeting, and I stared at it for approximately 4 minutes without seeing any of it. Then I picked up my coat, told the front desk I needed some air, and walked to the parking garage. I called Lorraine from the 3rd level, standing between 2 cars with the concrete cold through my coat. "You call my employer," I said. "HR department. Claimed I was unstable." Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Last week, apparently. Dr. Yi just told me." "Does he know about the investigation?" "No." I don't think so. This is just him burning fields. Good, she said. Write down everything Dr. Yi said to you. Time, date, her exact words as closely as you can remember them. Send it to me tonight. She paused. Sage. His attorney just confirmed the records exist. The cease and desist was the same. Every move he makes to protect himself creates another document. I know, I said. Your voice is very steady. My hands are not, I said. She made a small sound that in another context might have been a laugh. Go back to work. We are fine. I went back to work. I was fine. 3 weeks after that, Brooke came to Hartford. She called the morning of, which meant she was already in the car when she called, because Brooke did not give you enough notice to prepare. That was not an accident. She arrived at my apartment at noon with a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and that particular smile she had worn my entire life, the one that looked like warmth from across the room and was something else entirely up close. I feel like I never see you anymore, she said, settling onto my couch with her coat still half on. You've been so quiet. We all miss you. I poured the wine. I sat across from her. I let her talk. She was good at it. Brooke had always been good at the kind of conversation that felt casual and wasn't. She moved through topics the way you move through a house when you are looking for something specific but do not want anyone to know. Lingering in some rooms, passing quickly through others, doubling back. She asked about my work in a way that was really asking how much time I spent outside of it. She asked if I had been seeing anyone, and when I said no, something in her eyes registered and moved on. She asked if I had talked to anyone about the family lately, if I had any close friends she didn't know about, said it lightly, the way you say things you mean very seriously. Just the usual people, I said. I worry about you, she said. You've always been so private. Mom worries too. That's kind of her. She and Dad both want things to be better. I think the distance has been hard for everyone. I looked at my sister. My sister, who had received the sorority dues and the wedding venue and the house down payment and had kept a spreadsheet, according to Lorraine, tracking every disbursement. My sister who knew, who had always known. I'm good, Brooke, I said. I'm really good. She left an hour later. I stood at the window and watched her car pull out of the space below, and I thought about how much energy it must take to perform that level of ease for that long. I had done a version of it my whole life. I recognized the effort it required. I just recognized also what she was actually doing. The cease and desist arrived 10 days after Brooke's visit. A letter from an attorney I did not recognize representing Gerald Whitfield regarding what it described as unauthorized access to private family financial records and demanding that I immediately cease all inquiries into account, information belonging to members of the Whitfield family. I read it twice. I photographed it. I called Lorraine. He doesn't know what we have, I said. No, Lorraine said. He knows someone is pulling threads. He doesn't know how many threads or how far they lead. This letter is a guess dressed up as a threat. It's also a confession. It is also that, she agreed. His attorney has now put in writing that the records exist and that Gerald considers them private and worth protecting. We have subpoena power, Sage. They do not get to decide what we can access once we are in federal territory. She paused. I'm going to send a response through our channels. In the meantime, do nothing. Do not respond. Do not acknowledge. Do not let him know this landed. I folded the letter back into its envelope and put it on the pile with everything else. The pile was substantial by then. 3 years of documentation in a file box under my desk, organized chronologically, each document cross-referenced in a spreadsheet that June had helped me build. June Okafor had been working 2 desks for mine for 3 years before I told her anything. She was a forensic accountant on secondment from the hospital's finance division, running an audit project that had nothing to do with me, and we had been having lunch together for 18 months before the conversation shifted. I did not plan to tell her. What happened was that she mentioned offhandedly that she had spent the morning tracing a series of mislabeled internal transfers that had been hiding in plain sight for 6 years, and she said in her particular way that the thing about financial fraud is that people always think complexity protects them, when actually it is the opposite. Complexity creates a record, and records do not lie even when people do. I looked at her across the lunch table. June, I said, I need to show you something. She cleared her afternoon. She came to my apartment that evening and she sat at my kitchen table and she went through the documents for 4 hours without stopping, moving from page to page with the systematic focus of someone doing work she knows matters, making small notes in a notebook she had pulled from her bag. When she finished, she sat back and looked at me. The results came 6 weeks later. $763,000. That was the number June gave me when she sat across from me in Lorraine's office on a Thursday in early November, 7 weeks before Christmas, with a report that was 42 pages long and sourced to the document number. 29 years, she said. Consistent disbursements, small enough in any given year to avoid triggering automatic review thresholds, large enough in aggregate to finance everything. She turned to a page near the middle. Brooke's sorority dues, 4 years. Brooke's wedding, the venue, the catering, the honeymoon, the down payment on the house in Fairfield. Gerald's personal investment portfolio, 3 separate accounts. Vivian's design studio, the startup costs, 2 years of operating expenses. She set the report on the table and she looked at me. They did not just steal from you, she said. They built their entire life on your name. I looked at the number. $763,000 over 29 years, diverted from a trust my biological grandmother had established to protect me, used to finance a family I had never actually been part of, a family that had kept me at the far end of the table for 30 years and called it love. There is something else, Lorraine said. She opened her own file and placed a document on the table in front of me. It was from the medical records request I had filed 6 weeks earlier, pulling my full childhood health history from every provider who had treated me before I turned 18. The ones Rosemary had mentioned at dinner, the ones Gerald had always brought me to himself while Vivian stayed home. I had assumed pediatric thoroughness, standard monitoring. What the records showed was different. The appointments were evaluations. Specifically, they were physical examinations and health assessments conducted for the purpose of underwriting. Gerald had taken out a life insurance policy on me when I was 4 years old, a substantial policy, the kind that requires medical verification. The named beneficiary was Gerald Whitfield. The premiums had been paid annually from the trust fund. Gerald had insured a 4-year-old child using that child's own inheritance money and named himself the person who would profit if the child died. I read the document. I put it down. I picked it up and read it again. "Sage," Lorraine said. "I need a minute," I said. I sat with it. I let it land, the way terrible things need to land, fully, without rushing past the weight of it. The man who had brought me to those appointments, who had sat in the chair beside the examination table and asked the questions and driven me home in silence, had done all of it because a live child was useful to him in one way and a dead child would have been useful in another. I was an asset with multiple potential returns. He had hedged accordingly. After a while, I looked up at June and then at Lorraine. "All right," I said. "Tell me what comes next." What came next was Christmas. Lorraine walked me through it with the precision she brought to everything. The federal complaint was ready. The civil petition for guardianship disqualification was drafted, reviewed, and waiting. We had the financial documentation, the forensic analysis, June's report, the medical records, the credit history, 3 years of correspondence and notes and saved files, and the original probate documents from Vermont. What we did not have was the trigger. The disqualification clause required a public act, documented, witnessed, unambiguous. Gerald publicly repudiating me in front of people who could verify it, captured in a format that could be submitted to the court. "He will do it," I said. "You're certain?" "He has been doing it my entire life. The only difference is that no one was watching." I thought about the dinner table, the far end, the one photograph out of 7. He believes I am grateful. He believes I am manageable. He has spent 30 years confusing my silence with submission, and that confusion is the only thing we need. Lorraine looked at me for a moment. "You are going to have to sit at that table and let him say whatever he says." "Yes, and you are going to have to smile." "I know how to do that," I said. "I have been practicing for 30 years. I called Brooke and told her I would be there for Christmas Eve. She sounded pleased, which was its own kind of information. I confirmed the time, noted the date of the text in my phone, and went back to work. 48 hours before Christmas Eve, I drove to Lorraine's office and signed the final version of the federal complaint. Identity theft, wire fraud, financial exploitation of a minor, tax evasion on deductions Gerald had claimed on accounts opened in my name. The complaint was sealed pending the trigger event. Lorraine would file the motion to unseal the morning of December 26th. I drove home. I opened my closet and I looked at my dresses for a while. I chose the one Vivian had commented on 2 years earlier at a family dinner. A deep burgundy wrap dress that Vivian had said, in her warmest voice, made me look like I was trying too hard. I packed it carefully. I was ready. The dress hung on the back of my closet door on the morning of December 23rd, and I looked at it while I drank my coffee and went through the checklist one final time. Not a checklist on paper. I had stopped writing things down months earlier, once the habit of it had moved from the page into somewhere more permanent. The list lived in the same place. Everything else lived in the part of my mind that had been quietly, methodically running this calculation since I was 20 years old, and a credit card company told me I had a history I had never created. Federal complaint, signed, sealed, filed with Lorraine's office. Scheduled for unsealing December 26th. Forensic report, 42 pages, every transfer documented, every account sourced, June's signature on the cover page. Medical records, organized, cross-referenced, the insurance policy flagged and tabbed. Subpoena documents, the contents of Gerald's filing cabinet, obtained through Lorraine's legal discovery request 4 months earlier, cataloged by date and account number. Every page of what had been behind that lock, every signature in my name that I had never written, every account opened in my name before I was old enough to open a door by myself. I had read through the cabinet documents 3 times when they arrived. The first time I read them as a data analyst tracking the structure of what had been done, the architecture of it, the specific mechanisms Gerald had used to move money from one place to another while keeping my name on the front of everything and his hands on all the controls. The second time I read them as the person whose name was on every page, and that reading took longer. The third time I read them as someone who was about to end it, and that reading was the shortest. By then I knew every document. I did not need to read them again to know what they said. I set down my coffee cup and I went to pack for Westport. There is a particular quality to performing normalcy when you are 3 days from dismantling the most significant relationship of your life. Everything feels slightly heightened, slightly unreal, the way the air feels before a storm, when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. I drove to Westport in ordinary traffic, listening to ordinary radio, stopping at a gas station outside Bridgeport for coffee I did not particularly want. I arrived at the Whitfield house at 6:15. Vivian had outdone herself with the decorations, as she always did. Pine garland on the porch railing, candles in every window, the good china already set, visible through the dining room window from the driveway. 25 people, the same configuration as every year, cousins and aunts and uncles, arranged in the careful social architecture that Vivian maintained year-round and presented, at Christmas, as effortless. I found my place at the far end of the table. I had been sitting in a bathroom off the second-floor hallway for 6 minutes when my phone lit up with a text from Lorraine. I had sent her one word, his name, 3 minutes earlier. She had understood what it meant. What I had seen, from my seat at the far end of the table, was this. Gerald had been quiet through most of the first course, which was not unusual. He spoke in bursts and silences, and the silences were never empty. They were the spaces where he was deciding something. I had watched him through 32 years of those silences. I knew the difference between a man at rest and a man calculating. 3 minutes before he stood, Brooke leaned close to him and said something I could not hear. He turned to her. She said something else. He nodded once, a small, decisive motion, the kind that means a decision has been made rather than a decision is being considered. I had seen that nod before. I knew what followed it. I excused myself from the table and went upstairs. I typed, "He is going to do it tonight." Lorraine's reply came in 40 seconds. 2 words, "I am ready." I went back downstairs and sat down and picked up my fork. Gerald stood 4 minutes later. I watched him from the far end of the table, and I thought about Helen Rowe, who had never met me, who had sat with an attorney in Vermont and said, "Put in the clause, build in the exit." I thought about Lorraine in New Haven with the paperwork waiting. I thought about June, who had spent 6 weeks turning 30 years of financial fraud into 42 pages of documented evidence. I thought about all of it, every thread of it, and I felt something settle in my chest, the way a calculation settles when the final number comes in and it matches the projection exactly. Gerald raised his glass. He looked down the table. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I waited, and he gave me exactly what I had come for. The morning of December 25th, I sat at my kitchen table in Hartford, and I wrote down the 2 new details while they were still precise in my memory. The timing of the nod. The text to Lorraine. I added them to the file. Then I closed the file and made breakfast and waited for the federal case to enter its next phase. December 26th arrived quiet and cold. I was at my kitchen window with coffee when my phone rang. It was Lorraine. "They are there," she said. I did not ask who. I already knew. Federal agents had arrived at the Whitfield house in Westport at 8:15 in the morning. Gerald was in the driveway when they pulled up, which Lorraine told me later, and which I have thought about many times since. He was simply there, in his own driveway, on an ordinary December morning, the way you are when you believe nothing is coming for you. The agents identified themselves. They stated the charges. Gerald Whitfield was placed under arrest on federal charges of identity theft, wire fraud, financial exploitation of a minor, and tax evasion. He had spent 30 years believing that my silence was his protection. He was in handcuffs before he understood it had never protected him at all. Lorraine told me what happened after. Vivian appeared in the doorway while the agents were still in the driveway. She was dressed, hair done. The particular armor of a woman who had spent her entire adult life making sure she was always camera ready, always composed, always presenting the correct version of the Whitfield family to whoever was looking. She appeared in the doorway and she looked at the agents and she looked at Gerald, and she did what she had always done when a situation required management. She smiled. It was her best one. The warm, confused, "This must be a misunderstanding" smile she had used at school conferences and neighborhood disputes and every family dinner where something had gone sideways and needed to be smoothed over before anyone looked too closely. She looked at the agent nearest to her and she said, in her warmest voice, "I am sure this is a misunderstanding. We are a good family." The agent did not look up from his paperwork. He did not look up, and he did not respond, and he did not adjust his posture or his expression or the pace at which he was completing the forms in his hand. He simply continued working, because Vivian Whitfield's smile was not a fact he was required to process. The smile stayed on her face for 3 seconds after that. I know this because Lorraine described it to me later, because a neighbor had been watching from a window, because the detail made it into the account that circulated through the family in the weeks that followed, person to person, the way certain details do when they are too specific and too perfect to let go. 3 seconds, then the smile left her face. Gerald's expression, according to the same account, was blank, not frightened, not angry, blank. The expression of a man who has just encountered something his models did not predict, who is standing in the gap between what he expected to happen and what is actually happening, and has not yet found the language for the distance between them. He did not look at Vivian. He looked at the driveway. Trent Callahan called me the same afternoon. I had been expecting the call, or something like it. I had watched Trent at the dinner table on Christmas Eve, the color leaving his face, the napkin going down, the careful stillness of a man who is running numbers in his head and does not like what they are adding up to. Trent was a corporate accountant. He understood financial structures the way I understood data patterns. He had looked at his wife on Christmas Eve and she had not looked back, and that particular exchange had told him something his professional mind had immediately begun to verify. "I need to talk to you," he said when I answered. "I've been going through some things. I thought you might be. The files in Brooke's home office." He paused. "She has bank statements I didn't know existed. Transfer confirmations. A spreadsheet." Another pause. Sage, it's a spreadsheet of disbursements from your trust fund. She has been tracking it for years. I sat down, not from shock. I had known Brooke was not innocent. I had known it since the credit card denial, since the mortgage co-signature, since June had pulled every payment and traced it to its destination and shown me the full picture. But knowing something and hearing it spoken out loud by the person who found the proof are different weights of the same fact. How long? I said. The earliest entries are from when she was 22, maybe earlier. I don't know if there were other files. His voice had the quality of a man who is trying to stay analytical about something that is making him sick. She knew where the money came from, Sage. She knew what it was, and she tracked it, and she kept the records. Trent. Yeah. I'm gonna need you to send those to my attorney. Every file you found. Can you do that? Already done, he said. I sent them an hour ago. He was quiet for a moment. I told her this morning that I found them, that I was sending them. Another pause. I told her I'm filing for divorce. I did not say anything for a moment. Trent Callahan was a decent man who had married a woman without knowing the full dimensions of what she had come from and what she had agreed to. That was not his fault. None of this was his fault. I'm sorry, I said. I mean that. Don't be, he said. I needed to know. He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Lorraine called that evening to tell me the documents had arrived, that they were being processed, that Brooke's spreadsheet was precisely the piece of evidence that completed the chain, from Gerald's decisions to Brooke's participation end to end. Every dollar accounted for and acknowledged by at least one member of the family in writing. 3 days later, Rosemary came to Hartford. She knocked on my door on a Thursday afternoon carrying a casserole dish covered in foil and the expression of a woman who has been awake for several nights running and has a great deal to say and is not certain where to start. I let her in. I took the casserole. We sat at my kitchen table. She was Gerald's older sister. She had grown up with him. She knew him in the way that siblings know each other, which is to say that she knew the parts of him he thought he had hidden and the parts he had never tried to hide, and she had spent 67 years managing her understanding of both. She talked for a while about what she had watched at the dinner table, about the moment Gerald had said the words and she had understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has been waiting for a thing without knowing they were waiting for it, that he had just ended himself. She talked about the video on her phone, which she had already provided to Lorraine's office along with a formal witness statement. She talked about the 24 other people in that room who had also heard it, who had also given statements, who also remembered exactly what was said and in what order. Then she stopped talking about the dinner. Before you, she said. I want to tell you something that happened before you. I waited. Helen had 2 grandchildren. You know this now, I think. But the other one, the boy, Daniel Rowe. Helen's son had a child, a boy, a few years older than you. When Helen died, the trust covered both grandchildren in the original draft, but it was restructured before the final filing, and you became the sole beneficiary. She folded her hands on the table. Gerald knew about Daniel first. He looked into adopting him. He contacted the social services office in the county where Daniel was living. He was in the process of filing when Daniel's biological father showed up and contested it and took Daniel away before anything could be finalized. I was very still. He moved to you, Rosemary said, when Daniel was no longer available. He looked at the remaining beneficiary of Helen Rowe's estate, and he began the process of adopting you. She looked at me directly. He was shopping, Sage. He was shopping for a child with a trust fund, and you were the option that worked out. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator ran. Somewhere outside a car passed on the street. I had known, intellectually, since the probate records, that the adoption had been strategic. I had known it since Lorraine had explained the guardian clause to me, and I had understood what it meant that Gerald had specifically sought out a child whose inheritance required a legal guardian. But knowing the mechanism and knowing that there had been another child, a boy named Daniel, who had been considered and discarded before I was selected, were different kinds of knowledge. I had not been chosen. I had been available. Does Daniel know any of this? I said. I don't know where Daniel is, Rosemary said. I don't know if his father ever told him about the trust, about Helen, about any of it. I've thought about looking. She paused. I thought you should know first. She provided the phone video to Lorraine's office the same week, formally, with a witness statement attached. The video, combined with the statements from 24 other relatives, constituted the public repudiation required by the Trust's disqualification clause. Lorraine filed the petition that Friday. The court granted an emergency hearing. Gerald's guardianship was legally dissolved before the end of the month. The grand jury proceedings began in January. Brooke was subpoenaed. She had a choice, and the choice was not complicated, even if it was not easy. She could testify against her parents and receive consideration for her cooperation, or she could refuse and face conspiracy charges as an accessory who had, for years, maintained a personal record of trust fund disbursements made in her name. Brooke had always chosen herself. That had been true since she was 6 years old, and I had arrived at the far end of the hall, and she had understood immediately that her position in that family required maintenance. She had maintained it for 30 years. Now she chose herself one final time, in the only way the situation permitted. I was not in the room. I learned what happened from Lorraine, from the court record, from the one detail Trent shared with me in a brief message the evening after Brooke testified. She looked at Gerald from the witness stand. That was the detail. That was the one that mattered. She had sat in the chair, the room formal and quiet around her, and she had looked at her father, and Gerald had looked back the way he always looked at the people he believed he had secured, with the flat expectation of someone who had never once been failed by a bet he had placed. She did not hold. She answered every question. She confirmed every disbursement. She described the spreadsheet she had maintained, the records she had kept, the conversations she had been part of, the checks she had deposited, and the transfers she had acknowledged, and the years of silence she had maintained in exchange for the life the trust fund had purchased for her. When it was over, Gerald looked at the wall, not at Brooke, not at his attorney, at the wall, the middle distance, the place where a man looks when the thing he built has just been taken apart by the person he trusted most to hold it together. The Whitfield family did not end in an argument or a confrontation or a dramatic moment at a dinner table. It ended with a sworn statement, a spreadsheet, and a woman who had always chosen herself, choosing herself one last time, in the only direction the exit had left. The sentencing came in April, 4 months after the arrest, on a Thursday that arrived with the particular ordinariness of days that should feel larger than they do. Gerald Whitfield received 12 years on the federal charges: identity theft, wire fraud, financial exploitation of a minor, tax evasion on investment income he had sheltered across 4 accounts, opened in my name without my consent. His attorney had argued for leniency, had submitted character references from former colleagues at the Stanford firm, had presented Gerald as a man of standing whose judgment had been compromised by financial pressure. The judge had listened to all of it and sentenced him to 12 years. I was not in the courtroom. Lorraine had given me the option, and I had thought about it for several days before deciding against it. There was nothing I needed to see in that room. I had spent 3 years building toward a specific legal outcome, not toward the satisfaction of watching Gerald hear the number. The number was sufficient on its own. Lorraine called me from the courthouse steps and told me, and I thanked her, and I stood at my kitchen window for a while after I hung up. 12 years. Gerald was 61. He would be in his 70s when he came out, if he came out into a world where the financial infrastructure he had built across 3 decades had been dismantled, the assets frozen and largely seized, the reputation he had maintained through careful social architecture gone entirely. Vivian accepted a plea agreement in February. 3 years suspended with 2 years of supervised probation, restitution attached, her co-signatory status on every fraudulent account made part of the court record. Her attorney had argued that she had been under Gerald's influence, that she had signed what he put in front of her without full understanding of what she was signing. The judge had found this only partially persuasive. Vivian would not serve time, but she would spend the next 2 years checking in with a probation officer and paying back a portion of what she had helped take. She called me once, in March. The call came at 7:30 in the evening, and I looked at her name on the screen for a long time before I let it go to voicemail. She did not leave a message. The Whitfield family, as a social entity, dissolved in the weeks following Gerald's arrest with a speed that suggested it had always been more fragile than it appeared. Vivian's sister, the one who had sat 3 seats from me at Christmas dinners for 30 years, sent me a card. A plain card, no printed message, Just her handwriting. I did not know. I am sorry. That was all. I appreciated the plainness of it. I did not need more than that. The aunts and uncles and cousins, the 24 people who had been in that dining room, responded in the ways that people respond when the social architecture they have been living inside collapses without warning. Some withdrew entirely. Some sent messages. 2 of my cousins called not to apologize exactly, but to talk, which was its own kind of acknowledgement that something had been real and had been wrong. I appreciated those calls more than I expected to. The Whitfield name had been Gerald's primary investment. He had spent 30 years polishing it, presenting it, using it to open doors and generate trust and create the impression of a family with particular values and particular standing. By spring, it was finished. The firm in Stamford had already removed his name from their historical partnership list. The country club had not renewed his membership. In Westport, Connecticut, where reputation is maintained through proximity and carefully managed appearances, the withdrawal of social contact is its own verdict, and it had been delivered thoroughly. Brooke lost the house in Fairfield County in March. The civil restitution order attached a lien to the property, and with Trent's divorce proceeding moving forward and her parents' financial support eliminated, she could not carry the mortgage alone. I did not follow the details closely. I knew the broad shape of what had happened to her, and I let that be enough. Brooke was 35 years old, and she had a real estate license, and she was, underneath everything, capable of building a life that did not require someone else's name as its foundation. Whether she would choose to do that was not my responsibility to determine. I thought about her occasionally. Not with anger by then. With something more like the flat recognition you feel when you look at a dataset and understand why a particular pattern developed without feeling any particular way about the pattern itself. Brooke had been given a specific set of incentives her entire life, and she had responded to those incentives consistently. That was not a mystery. It was not even, in the end, particularly interesting. What was interesting was that she had chosen, at the moment of maximum consequence, to tell the truth, and I thought that mattered even if she had done it entirely for herself. The civil judgment came through that summer. Lorraine had filed the guardianship disqualification petition in late December, and the court had granted the emergency hearing within days of receiving the formal submission, the video, and the witness statements from 24 people who had been in the Whitfield dining room on Christmas Eve. Gerald's guardianship was dissolved. Full control of the remaining trust transferred to me. The restitution calculation took longer. June worked with the court-appointed financial reviewer for 4 months, going through every transfer, every account, every disbursement, applying interest calculations to the amounts that had been diverted over 29 years. The civil judgment against Gerald and Vivian Whitfield came to $741,000, attached to their remaining assets, collectible against any future income. The trust itself held $38,000 when I took control of it. The restitution, combined with the seized assets that were directed to the civil judgment, would bring the total recoverable amount to somewhere near the original $800,000 that Helen Rowe had intended for me. It would not arrive all at once. Some of it would take years to collect, but for the first time in my life, money in my name was actually in my name, controlled by my hand, signed for by my signature. I called June when the final judgment figure came through. She picked up on the first ring. "It matches the projection," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Within what margin?" "Less than 2%. She made a sound I had never heard from her before, something between a laugh and relief, and she said, "The math does not lie, Sage." "No," I said, "it does not. Vermont in June is different from Vermont in November." The farmhouse road that I had driven in bare-limbed November gray was green now, the maples full and deep, the fields along the road running with long grass that moved when the wind came through. I had looked up the cemetery in the town records. It was 3 miles from where Helen's farmhouse had been, a small country cemetery maintained by the township, set back from the road behind a low stone wall. I found the headstone on the east side near the wall, a modest gray granite marker with her name and her dates. Helen Margaret Rowe. She had been 63 years old when she died, which meant she had been 61 when I was born, and 62 when she established the trust. She had known she was sick. She had known she was running out of time. She had sat with an attorney and thought very carefully about what she was leaving behind and who was in charge of delivering it. and she had decided not to trust the delivery entirely to the goodwill of the people she was leaving it with. She had put in the clause. The stone was well maintained. The grass around it was trimmed. Someone was tending to it, though I did not know who, whether a neighbor or a township volunteer or someone else who had known her, some thread of connection I had not yet traced. I sat down on the grass beside it. The cemetery was quiet except for birds and the sound of wind in the trees along the wall. I do not know how long I sat there, long enough for the sun to move, long enough for the particular quality of the grief to arrive and settle and become something I could hold without bracing against it. This was the grief I had not let myself feel in Lorraine's office, or in my apartment in Hartford, or in the parking garage when my hands were shaking after the meeting with Dr. Yi. The grief that belongs to a relationship that never existed and should have. The grief for a woman who had loved me in the most practical and lasting way she knew how, from a distance she could not close, across a life she would not be there to witness. She had tried to protect me. She had done everything an estate attorney in Vermont in the 1990s could do to protect a 2-year-old girl from the people who were going to be in charge of her. And it had not been enough to prevent what Gerald did, but it had been exactly enough to undo it. I reached into my bag and I took out the document I had brought. The guardianship disqualification order, the trust restoration filing, my name at the top and Helen's name in the body of the text, the court seal at the bottom. I looked at it for a moment. Then I set it on the grass in front of the headstone, held down at one corner by a small stone I found beside the wall. I did not have a speech. I had thought, on the drive up, that I might have something to say, some formal acknowledgement, something that would make the visit feel complete in the way that certain moments require completion. But sitting there with the document on the grass between us, I found there was nothing to say that the paper did not already say. Her name and my name on the same document, the trust she had built, restored to the person she had built it for, 3 decades late and complete. I sat with her for a while longer. Then I got up, brushed the grass from my jeans, and took the document back. I folded it carefully and put it in my bag. I wanted to keep it. The house was in Glastonbury, 12 minutes from my apartment in Hartford. A small craftsman bungalow on a street with old trees and a sidewalk that needed work in 2 places, and a neighbor who had already waved at me twice from her porch. I had bought it in May, the closing on a Thursday afternoon in Lorraine's office, my signature on every page of every document, my name on the deed in handwriting that was entirely my own. I had taken a week to move in, not because I had much to move, but because I wanted to do it without rushing to put each thing in its place deliberately, to learn the particular sound the floors made and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the late afternoon, and the specific quality of quiet in those rooms when everything was still. On a Saturday in late June, I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the street and thought about the word mine. Not the legal definition of it, not the court documents or the deed or the restored trust account with my name at the top. The feeling of it, the specific interior sensation of standing somewhere and knowing that every object in your line of sight, every document in every drawer, every signature on every page attached to this place and this life had been made by your own hand with your own knowledge for your own reasons. I had been 32 years old at that Christmas table. I was 32 years old now, standing on this porch, and I was aware that the distance between those 2 versions of the same age was not measurable in months. It was measurable in what I knew about myself, what I had stopped pretending, what I had decided I was no longer willing to perform. The gratitude performance was over. I had been performing it since I was 3 years old. Since the first morning I woke up in that pale green room and understood without being told that my presence in that house was something I needed to justify continuously. I had performed it at Christmas tables and in driveway conversations and in my supervisor's office and on the phone with my father after a credit card company told me I had a history I had never made. I had been so good at it that Gerald had mistaken the performance for the reality, and had built his entire confidence on the assumption that the performance would continue indefinitely. It had continued exactly long enough. I went inside. The floors made their particular sound under my feet. Light came through the kitchen window and made a rectangle on the floor that moved slowly as the morning went on. I put my cup in the sink, and I looked at the room around me. Every document bearing my name in this house had been signed by my hand. Every key on the ring by the door was a key I had been given because a lock existed that belonged to me. Every number and every account attached to my life had been put there by my own choices and my own labor, and the money my grandmother had tried to give me was coming back slowly, document by document, in the amounts and on the schedule the court had ordered into an account. I opened myself at a bank. I chose myself on a day I drove there alone. They called me a mistake for 30 years. They were right about one thing. I was never supposed to be theirs. I was always supposed to be mine.